As I mentioned earlier, we will be reviewing the last three chapters in the Gospel according to Matthew. But I wanted to, I guess, reframe our minds as to why it's important, I think, for us to be looking at this time of year. And if you go to your Bibles to Galatians chapter 1, I want us to read here the true and to borrow a phrase that's oftentimes referenced in the world you and I live in today at the other time of the season. The true reason for the season we're in is Jesus Christ himself. And beginning in verse 1 of Galatians chapter 1, Paul, an apostle, not sent from men, nor through the agency of man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead, and all the brethren who are with me, to the churches of Galatia, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, who gave himself for our sins, so that he might rescue us from this present evil age, according to the will of our God and Father, to whom be glory forever. Amen. When we really think about the reasons why it's so important for us to focus on the way we offering, why it's so important for us to focus, even as we will today, on the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ, is because of what we read right here. He gave himself for our sins, that he might rescue us from the evil present age that we live in right now. And this was all done according to the will of the Father. And of course, we know that the Father had to resurrect Jesus in order for Jesus to be able to resurrect us. So it's important for us to truly grasp and understand the reason for the season that we're in right now, the central characters and the rationale about why we spend the time we spend, and why we acknowledge, and why we put glory to the rightful owner of where glory lies. So with that, if you will turn over to Matthew chapter 26, this is a rather long chapter, 75 verses, and many things are listed in here. There is obviously going to be the Passover we recently gone through, but there's also going to be other aspects of things that we have touched on throughout this season of the year, regarding Peter, regarding the activities that led up to Jesus Christ's actual crucifixion. But one thing I want us to take note of is something that Jesus took note of, so it's important for us to take note of. It is this individual that is in the house of Simon the leper in Bethany that actually prepares his body for burial with this perfumed oil that is, he wanted to make sure will always be acknowledged. So we need to always acknowledge it. So I'll begin in verse 1, and we'll go through this entire chapter, and I'm going to be reading in the New American Standard. In verse 1 of chapter 26, we read, "When Jesus had finished all these words, he said to his disciples, 'You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be handed over for crucifixion.' Then the chief priests and the elders of the people were gathered together in the court of the high priest named Caiaphas, and they plotted together to seize Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they were saying, 'Not during the festival, otherwise a riot might occur among the people.' Now when Jesus was in Bethany at the home of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster vial of very costly perfume, and she poured it on his head as he reclined at the table. But the disciples were indignant when they saw this and said, 'Why this waste? For this perfume might have been sold for a high price and the money given to the poor.' But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you bother the woman? For she has done a good deed to me. For you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me. For when she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. Truly I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be spoken of in memory of her." Then one of the 12, named Judas Iscariot, went to the high priest and said, "What are you willing to give me to betray him to you?" And they weighed out 30 pieces of silver to him. For then on he began looking for a good opportunity to betray Jesus. Now when the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" And he said, "Go into the city, and a certain man, and say to him, the teacher says, my time is near. I am to keep the Passover at your house with my disciples." The disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. Now when evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12 disciples, and they were eating, and he said, "Truly I say to you, that one of you will betray me." Being deeply grieved, they each began to say to him, "Surely not I, Lord." And he answered, who has dipped his hand with me in the bowl is the one who betrayed me. The Son of Man is to go just as it is written of him. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born. Then Judas, betraying him, said to him, "Surely it is not I, Rabbi." And Jesus said to him, "You have said it yourself." While they were eating, Jesus took some bread, and after a lesson, he broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." And when he had taken a cup, given thanks, he gave it, saying, "Drink, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. But I say to you, that I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." After singing the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And then Jesus said to them, "You will all fall away because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike down the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock shall be scattered. But after I have been raised, I will go ahead of you to Galilee." Then Peter said to him, "Even though all may fall away because of you, I will never fall away." Jesus said to him, "Truly I say to you, that this very night, before a rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." Peter said to him, "Even though I have died with you, I will not deny you." All the disciples said the same thing too. Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane, and said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And he took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, and began to be grieved and distressed. And he said to them, "My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch with me." And he went a little beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "So you men could not keep watch with me for 1 hour? Keep watching and praying, that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." He went again a second time and prayed, saying, "My Father, if this cannot pass away unless I drink it, your will be done." again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. And then he left them again, and went away, and prayed a third time, saying the same thing once more. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. Behold, the one who betrays me is at hand. And while he was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, came up, accompanied by a large crowd with swords and clubs, who came from the high priests and elders of the people. Now he who was betraying him gave him a sign, saying, Whomever I kiss, he is the one, seize him. Immediately Judas went to Jesus and said, Hail, Rabbi, and kissed him. And Jesus said to him, Friend, do what you have come for. Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And behold, one of those who was with Jesus reached and drew out his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut his ear off. Then Jesus said to him, Put your sword back into its place, for all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword. Or do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? How then will the scriptures be fulfilled, which say that it must happen this way? At that point, Jesus said to the crowd, Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me, as you would against a robber? Every day I used to sit in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But all of this has taken place to fulfill the scriptures of the prophets. Then all of the disciples left him and fled. Those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and elders were gathered together. But Peter was following him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and entered in and sat down with the officers to see the outcome. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus, so that they might put him to death. They did not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. But later on, two came forward and said, This man stated that I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. The high priest stood up and said to him, Do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you? But Jesus kept silent. And the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus said, You have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand, power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Of course, this is a text that's written in Daniel chapter 7, verse 13, that Jesus is referencing. Verse 65, Then the high priest tore his robes and said, He has blasphemed. What other need do we have of witnesses? Behold, you have now heard the blasphemy. What do you think? They answered. He deserves death. Then they spat in his face. They beat him with their fists, and others slapped him and said, Prophesy to us, O Christ. Who is the one who just hit you? Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him and said, You too were with Jesus the Galilean. But he denied it before them all, saying, I don't know what you're talking about. When he had gone out of the courtyard of the gateway, another servant girl came to him and said, For those who were there, this man was with Jesus of Nazareth. And again he denied with an oath, I do not know the man. A little later, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, surely you too are one of them, for even the way you talk gives you away. Then he began to curse and swear, I do not know the man. And immediately a rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the words which Jesus had said, before a rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. We see here, obviously, the prelude of many things that came before Jesus Christ's actual crucifixion, this, as we would call it today, a kangaroo trial that goes on with the religious establishment at the time. But there are, some, I think, some interesting things for us to consider that even go beyond just the storyline that we read. And the storyline, of and by itself, I think is very intriguing. One of the things that I want us to look at and ask the questions, we begin to just have some open dialogue here, is what do we actually learn about the character of the Jewish leaders, the religious leaders of that time?
They were afraid of his power and his authority because the people are following him and they're afraid they're going to lose that authority over the people.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I think that's true. In fact, the next chapter is going to be identified specifically because it was out of envy that they did all this, and Pilate knew it. Everyone knew. They knew what was really behind the scenes. What else can we ascertain about the character of this religious establishment? Ms. Mogan? Mhm. Interesting that lies would be used as evidence in a trial, for which you would think, if nothing else, this is being done by religious leaders, truth would be what would be evidence, not lies. But they were willing to take lies and live by their decision and stand by their decision based upon lies. Speaks, I think, to a great deal about what their character was. Anything else? Bill? That'll definitely be in the next chapter for sure. Yeah. Mhm. You know, it's one of those things when you look at this particular chapter, and like I said, the next chapter definitely comes with the mob mentality in front of Pilate and the crowds. But here you have even a smaller group, and it makes you wonder, you know, were they hand selected as far as the individuals that were there, possibly. Um, but it is very telling in that just because they have a religious title does not mean that the character matches up to what the title represents. And I think that's a lesson for you and a lesson for myself. We take on the title of a Christian, say we are disciples of Jesus Christ, but does the character back up that? Which I think, you know, when you think about the churches and Paul referencing so many times busybodies, gossips, and oftentimes what's associated with those things, lies. So it is something for us to consider, I think, as we see this example before us of these of the character of these individuals. What does the meeting place, the house or home of Simon the leper, tell us about the character of Jesus?
He respected everybody.
Exactly. I think that is exactly the point right there, Tim. He was not an individual that would only go to certain types of people's homes. You know, he would use and say that sick people are the ones that need the doctors, meaning he was going to the sinners. He was, and of course, we know that the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the lawyers, the scribes, the upper echelon, they didn't like the individuals that he hung out with. Now, I think we obviously know he didn't condone activities of sin, but he did not separate himself which is, I find it interesting what the word Pharisee means, separate. And yet we seem to sometimes think that, and even in what's the churches of God, there's this separation, walls put up sometimes. And yet Jesus was an individual that crossed barriers, spoke, hung out with, did things with people for the purposes of having interaction and bringing them to him, which sometimes I think, even in the churches of God, wrong example set. But I think, you think about it, it appears that obviously Simon could have been one of those, as many people think, was healed by Jesus. I think this goes back to Mark chapter 14:3. And there it is that there's an individual that's healed of leprosy. So it is thought that is possibly Simon, and this is his house. What significance can you see around or develop in your mind of a lesson or lessons that we draw from this woman who pours this perfumed oil on Jesus? The little dial, there's no green button, just the dial back there. Turn the dial right there by the mouse, the dial. Turn it. You can turn it off if you want to. Yeah, the dial. There's a on and off button on the side. So getting back to what we're talking about, this perfumed oil that the woman pours on Jesus. What lessons can we draw from this? Because obviously it's important. Jesus makes the point of saying what she's done will always be remembered when this gospel is given. So there's something there for us to understand.
It was her devotion, and the cost was not relevant at all in her mind. It was her devotion to Jesus. It surpassed everything. So I guess the lesson that I could draw is that I don't need to have anything that I put higher or is more important, and it's got to be my devotion to the Christ.
Okay. Just curious, has anyone ever thought about this before? I mean, sometimes I've never really heard anyone ever mention it in any of the discussions over the years that they brought up this woman, yet Jesus put so much focus on her, and yet no one ever talks about it. But I do think that that is one of the lessons. I would dare say that it's maybe more to it than that story, but I think that that is one chief thing we take out of that is she was willing at all costs, at a very high expense, I should say, because as you remember, Jesus would take note of a widow who gives two insignificant coins of value, but says she gave everything. And he called that out too. So the level of devotion given is what he's calling out and making a memorial of here of her. Something for you and I to consider. Khaki.
And also, and I'm not sure, we don't have any evidence of what her understanding of what Christ was going to go through and all, but she was preparing him for burial. That's one of the things that the women would do for those who had died was to, what's the word I'm looking for, not douse them, but
Anointed for burial.
yeah, they would use precious oils and whatnot to prepare them for burial, and that would fulfill the prophecy.
Yeah. I think there is an element of prophecy associated with many of things you see here because Jesus even makes reference a couple of times in what we just read that these things were done to fulfill the scriptures, all pointing to him being the Messiah. And so this is, I think, something as well that is a part of maybe she didn't know what she was doing. He had already told them in chapter verse 2 that it was coming to the point where he was about to be handed over for crucifixion. And we don't even, I mean, we don't get a clear indication that the disciples really were able to connect the dots, even though they said the words directly to them. But I do think that when we look at this example, and I encourage all of us to really think about this, because I don't hear very many people talking about it very often whatsoever. And if Jesus made a point to say that whenever this gospel is preached in the whole world, he says, what this woman has done will also be spoken in memory of her, yet so little attention's given to it. And I think it is a part of what he's referencing, how she apparently, while the disciples are arguing about the value of this and being used maybe for good purposes, he's looking at the fact that she didn't hold anything back and giving everything she could for him, which is, I think, a lesson for each one of us to learn from her in this case, and something that's very important for us to consider. Mr. Bogan?
Excuse me, I think she knew that he was, we could say, the best.
Mm-hmm.
She wanted the best for him,
Mm-hmm.
most expensive.
Right. Which would be another way of saying we should give our best, every effort that we give, not half-hearted, not begrudgingly, but give our best. And I think that's a very good point too. Bill?
She was either a woman of means or represented a family or someone else of means, because she was wealthy and came with this very expensive ointment to Christ in this fashion. And in Scripture, we have another reference of a lawyer who was rich, and Jesus sent him away as he was not going to part with his wealth in order to help others. So this, as far as we can tell, is one, maybe one of the few, if not the only reference in Scripture where a person who was deemed wealthy at that time glorified God in such a fashion.
That's possible. Very possible. I just want to read something to you that I picked up on this. Um, Again, this is somewhat speculative in nature, but the person that wrote this, he says, the woman, we know that the perfume in those days was a luxury item, even much more than it is today. Perfume was rare. Factories didn't crank it out by the tons. Ingredients were hard to come by, and it was handmade. What the perfume originally, what was it intended for, we really don't know. But it is safe to assume that it had been saved for a most special occasion, such as a wedding. In the passage, people conclude that it could have been sold for 300 denarii. That's roughly a well paid worker would have received for an entire year. This was not a small gift. It's interesting to consider that this gift, in comparison with the widow's gift in the last chapter, while one gift was tiny and the other huge in numeric value, both touched Christ's heart and were deeply valued by him. And of course, the question, what can we learn from the woman? I think we like to think of these items in relationship to our society. But in that society, even if she was a woman of means or a family of means, it didn't mean you just wore it. You wore it only on a certain situation and occasion. So I think that even goes to a greater value of what Jesus is trying to get across that we sometimes just read right over and never even think about. And I think that speaks to this woman.
And it also speaks to the culture, because that was probably scandalous.
Could have been.
For a woman to come in there and touch a man's feet or any part of him, and he accepted it as her worship.
Well, he poured it on his head in this case, but there was another one. Yeah, she with her tears. Yeah.
But it would be scandalous for a woman to come into like a home like that
Mm-hmm.
and touch a male. So the fact that some cultural barriers
Or being broken.
Jesus looked on her with love.
Yeah.
He didn't recoil or anything like that.
Yep. Next question I have on here is, what can we learn from Judas? I know sometimes nobody, you really don't want to think about that, but obviously you talk about the antagonist in the story, which ultimately is really Satan. But coming into this particular individual, and this individual becomes a vehicle by which this all occurs. What are some things that we can learn from Judas?
Jude started out being acting his friend because you can't get betrayed by an enemy. You don't want to get betrayed by a friend.
That's true. Never let down your guard. That's one thing, one lesson. Ms. Bowden?
We need to be very careful who we listen to and what they're saying.
Mhm.
Because it said in scripture, Satan had
Entered into him.
and he was listening. He was interested in the money. They bought him with money, or
Mhm.
Satan bought him with money. And like things maybe are going on in this world today, they don't always know what they're doing. They're focused on something else that Satan has put in their mind, and doing these protests. And I think when their mind is clear and they see what they've done, it's too late. They've already done it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It said he repented bitterly. I don't know how good that repentance is for him.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll read in the next chapter where he's remorseful for what he did at the end. You're right. There's that element. When you think about it, to your point, we should take from this example of Judas Iscariot that we need to be careful. The Apostle Paul says, try the spirits. Just because a thought comes into your mind, just because someone says something and it sounds good on the surface, we're still told to try the spirits. And I think that's important because there are influences all around us. It can be family members, it can be church members, it can be people in the world. There are all kinds of things around us. And ultimately, you are responsible for you, and I'm responsible for me. And regardless of how powerful that influence is, and we know Satan is very powerful, if our minds and hearts are taking every thought into captivity, as Paul says, and balancing that against Christ, then that's the only way we can overcome it as well. So I think that's another element there that is a powerful learning experience for us here. Bill, I think you had your hand.
Kind of goes back to Matthew 10, verse 36, where Christ says, a man's enemy shall be those of his own household.
Could be.
So this was in his inner circle.
Right.
For this
Khaki.
Two things that I take away from that section. One, and it's the ugly truth that all of us have the potential for sin.
Mm-hmm.
We don't like this. We look at Judas, we go, I would never do anything.
Right.
But we all have the potential, and that's why, as you brought out during the season, we need to self-examine. We need to take it to the Lord and ask Him to search and test us like David did. So that's one. The other is that I took away is we got folks who sound very spiritual, and Judas sounded very spiritual. We need the money for the poor.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus. So we have to, and you brought it up Ms. Logan, that you got to be very careful to look at the character and to evaluate. Just don't go by the leaves, the flowery speech, or maybe they can recite scripture in their sleep or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Spiritually, he was corrupt, and his heart got exposed when he went to the Pharisees. We see the true condition of his heart.
There's something to be said. We talk about this. I remember one time in one of the recent history, not the last election, but a couple of elections back, there was a discussion about charisma versus character. People gravitate to charisma. Now, I know many may not believe this, and that's fine. I have a personal opinion when we talk about Second Thessalonians that there is coming this man of sin. And I don't believe it's the Pope. I believe it's someone that will come from within the church. And this individual will come and be very charismatic. But we need to look at and test all the spirits and always. Now, I could be very wrong. That's true. But my point is always be on your guard, as Tim said, and try the spirits, like Ms. Vogan said, no matter what you think, whether you think it's going to be a physical structure that's built as a temple, or if you think it's going to come from the spiritual temple, always be on your guard. And I think that is one thing we learn from here. Now, you think about Judas, what could have led him to do all this? Could he have been just a bad seed to begin with? I've heard people speculate on that. What is his fate? Is he doomed for the lake of fire? Will he be given another chance? And I've heard ministers in churches of God say definitely and dogmatically one answer or the other. It's not my point, and it's not my call. It's only Jesus Christ to make that call. Now, Jesus made some very powerful statements here. But here's the thing, not one of us has the right to judge him ultimately. We can judge these acts. They're very bad. There's no getting around that. But to judge his ultimate fate, I don't know. That's up for Christ to make that decision. Because some people say because he committed suicide, as we'll read a little bit later, that seals his fate. I don't know the answer to that. God's grace and mercy is far greater than what we have as human beings, and far greater than some of these religious leaders and churches of God who are so dogmatic about their statements too. And I firmly believe that. But you got to wonder. And of course, some of this is a bit speculatory in nature, but maybe Judas felt like he wasn't getting the priority that he should have among the disciples. I don't know. Envy could have entered into this. Envy can enter into of us if we're not careful. Ego, self. Why am I not getting to do that? All those things can play into that. But you'll have to go to meeting and do the allow to be able to do that. But the thing that I think is important here is that you got Judas doing something, and then also, you bring in Peter and what Peter did. Peter makes the point here of, no, I'll never deny you, and he denies him. Judas didn't make the bold statement, although it says all the others did the same, so he could have very well made the statement too. But you have a verbal denial, and then you have a denial that results in actions too, in both of these individuals. Something for us to think about.
Can you hear me?
Keki, you were going to statement, I believe. Oh,
Can you hear me?
Tim?
I'm thinking about two scriptures in Revelation, also back in Old Testament, when Joseph, with his brother, when he started dreaming with dreams, stuff like that, he traded
Hello?
his brother because they thought he was a threat because he told them, I'm going to be over y'all. Get that. You can be working for me.
Yeah.
That did well for them.
Right.
That on the train, all of them, over Reuben, like stop him. And Reuben had no say so in it. Now we were just going to kill him. Now don't kill him. Let's sell him to the Moabite. Let's get rid of him. So the day that he died.
Yeah. Envy can be a powerful thing, I guess, whether it's in other families or in this case, a discipleship relationship too.
Hello?
And we can look at that as being like a small church if you want to ultimately look at that. But the point I'm driving to is envy can be a powerful thing that can lead to a lot of wrong activities too.
Can you hear me?
Okay, hold on just one second.
Can you hear me now? Okay, I was waiting until Neil got back up.
Okay.
So you can hear me, Neil?
Yes.
Okay. When you're asking about what do I learn from Judas, and I haven't been able to hear everybody's comments, so someone may have already said this, and this is just what I've often wondered. It's not something really biblically, I don't think you can prove, but I think one of the things I learned from Judas is not to take matters into my own hands, because I've personally thought before that Judas was amongst the disciples for those 3.5 years. And we all know from other scriptures that they thought Christ was going to set the kingdom up at that time. And even in the garden, when Peter pulled out his sword, they in their mindset, they were preparing, they thought they were going to physically be taking over the kingdom. And I believe Judas, I've often wondered if Judas, trying to jumpstart or accelerate what was going to happen, I've often thought that he took matters into his own hands and made it where Jesus would be taken, because he personally didn't think Jesus, that it would go down the way that it went down. That is speculation, but if that is true, then what you see is him taking matters into his own hands. Very similar to, there's been different fashions over the years that have tried to begin wars in the Middle East just because they think when the war starts in the Middle East, Christ is returning. Um, if that makes any kind of sense, I think it's just, to me, one of the things. I mean, there's many lessons you can learn from it, but the one for me was, don't take matters into your own hand. God has His own timeline. He doesn't need you to force things.
That's true. I mean, that's a possibility. You might want to go in there and turn that button off again.